This is Contractor Sense with Ruth King.
Welcome to Contractor Sense. Here you discover ideas, tactics, news, and information that matters to your contracting business and you. I'm your host, Ruth King. This episode is sponsored by Financially Fit Business. Get the business tool that makes your financial statements come alive and turns data into impactful graphs that help you see the financial health of your business. Go to www.financiallyfit.business and get started today. Thank you for joining us. Here's how we will help your business and you. In the two previous podcasts, I introduced the concept of death by 1,000 cuts, how the ancient Chinese tortured people. No one single cut killed them. However, it was the accumulation of 1,000 cuts or more that eventually killed the person. I've discussed running your business on cash, ignoring cash trends, and not answering the phone, which can put you out of business. Little cuts, but it can do it. In this episode, I give you another cut. Don't pay attention to the bottom line as you grow. So many of you, and even your CPAs, we had a situation where a CPA walked into a contractor's office to review financial statements with a contractor, and he said, "You did better this year than last year." And the contractor looked at him and he said, "What do you mean?" And the CPA said, "Well, last year you were at this revenue, and this year you're at this revenue." And the contractor looked at him and said, "Did you look at my bottom line? It's worse than it was last year." So even CPAs are focused on top line growth rather than looking at profitability. It is what you generate is important. What you keep is even more important. All right. So the little cut is not paying attention to the bottom line as you grow. Okay. It's really interesting. I go to conferences all the time and I hear contractors talking about, hey, we grew revenue by X% this year or Y% this year, or da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Who cares? What did you grow your bottom line by? And nobody talks about it. Nobody brags about bottom line. They only brag about top line revenue growth. So I want you to brag about bottom line revenue growth to your people. You don't have to go announce it at a trade show or something, a meeting or anything along those lines. What's important is very much the bottom line. If your top line is growing and your overhead is growing at the same rate as your top line, we have a problem because your bottom line's not growing, and more than likely it's probably going down. And how would your overhead increase at the same rate as your revenue? Marketing. I see it over and over and over and over again where somebody is spending more and more dollars on marketing and they're just spending the same percentage or a higher percentage of revenue and not necessarily looking at what that marketing spend is producing. All right. It's really important that if you're going to spend $1 on marketing, how much revenue, preferably how much profit, are you going to get? And most marketing companies don't like me very much because I ask the bottom line question. I don't ask the top line question. So here's the question, and I'll give you Ruth's rule number 2 to be able to figure out what the answer needs to be. So let's assume that a marketing company wants you to invest $10,000 a month on marketing. And you tell the marketing company, "Terrific, I'm happy to spend $10,000 a month on marketing." And your gross margin is 40%. So what you do to break even is you take the overhead expense, which is the $10,000, and divide it by 40%, which gives you $25,000 in break-even revenue that this $10,000 spend has to generate just to break even. So you say to the marketing salesperson, you say, "Great, I'm happy to spend or invest," whichever way you want to look at it, the $10,000 to on XYZ, A, B, and C, marketing and branding, whatever. I need to generate a break-even amount of $25,000 on this $10,000 investment. Can you guarantee me that? It's exactly what happens. Dead silence. because they want you to spend. They're looking only at the revenue dollars. They're not looking at what needs to happen for the company to break even on it. And so they're not going to put that on paper. I promise. If you find somebody who will put that on paper and they will guarantee the spend, let me know, because I want to talk to that person or that company. From that perspective, it's really important because they truly understand bottom line marketing, not necessarily top line marketing. So, yeah, and I gave you Ruth's rule, and Ruth's rule number 2 is that if you want to determine the break-even revenues that you need, you take the overhead expense and divide it by your gross margin. And in this case, we had a $10,000 overhead expense. Our gross margin was 40%, and our break-even revenues were $25,000. All right. But let's assume that you don't want to just break even and you want to actually generate a profit. So you use Ruth's rule number 3, which is our $10,000. We have a 40% gross margin and we want a 7% profit. So that gives us 33% on the bottom line. And that gives us $10,000 divided by 33%, which is $30,000 or thereabouts. So at that particular point, we need to talk to the marketing company and say we have to generate that much rather than the $25,000, which was break even. Okay. So that's Ruth's rule number 2 and number 3. And it doesn't have to be used for marketing expense. It could be used for somebody you're sending to a training class, to going to a meeting, that your suppliers have, could be going to a trade show. Figure out what the expense is and divide by your gross margin. And that's the break-even revenues that you have to pay for that particular expense. So after the break, I'm going to give you more examples of why you have to look at the bottom line rather than necessarily only the revenue line. Thanks for listening to Contractor Sense. We'll be right back.
Imagine you had total freedom. You didn't have to worry about money. You didn't have to be a slave to your business. The words, "I can't," are eliminated from your vocabulary. What if you could do what you want to do, whenever you want to do it? A financially fit business could give you that freedom. How? By knowing what your financial statements are telling you and taking action based on what they say. You can do this in less than 10 minutes a month, at an investment of less than taking your family out to dinner once a month. And if your financial statements are a mess, you can get help. Go to www.financiallyfit.business or click on the QR code below to get started today.
Before the break, I gave you the rules for determining break-even revenue that you have to have just to pay for any overhead expense that you have. And you're going to say, well, what does that really have to do with my bottom line? Because at that point, my bottom line would be 0 unless you used Ruth's rule number 3. So, no revenue growth is boring. This was given to me by a client who had been growing his top line business by about 30% a year for a lot of years, and is now to the point where he's about to run out of cash because the business has gotten big enough and funding this growth machine and funding it and not saving any money and just spending money. You will and can grow yourself out of business. All right. Be very careful with that. So I challenged him by saying, okay, no revenue growth is boring. Why is it boring? Well, it's just boring. I don't have enough to do. Yeah, you do. Believe me, with the size of business he was at, it was there. I said, okay, what if I challenge you to grow net operating profit by 30% instead of revenue? And he looks at me and is like dead silence. That would be a better goal than growing revenue by 30%. It's a lot more in depth and harder because you just can't use marketing dollars. And to grow revenue by 30%, that's, a marketing issue more so than anything else. But bottom line, it's not the marketing issue. And, he's not going to cut back a whole lot on marketing. I know this contractor very, very, very well. But if we can say, let's grow revenue by the rate of inflation for the next year, and I know it's the end of the year, and this is why I'm telling you the story. is that we need to make the decision about where we're going to go from a revenue and profit perspective and desired profit perspective for next year. So the challenge really and truly is if you grow your revenue 5%, which is the rate of inflation, which you have to grow at least, okay, every year. Otherwise, you are going backwards. How do you grow the profits by 30%? And that's the fun part about all of this. So how do you grow profits by 30%? Well, if you all remember, the way that we generate revenue in the contracting business is by a billable hour. No billable hours, no revenue. Okay. So if you look at the overhead and you look at the non-billable hours that this company is paying, if we turn every one of those non-billable hours into a billable hour, then overhead drops and revenue increases, right? So what we obviously need to do, number one, is to increase the productivity of all of their field personnel because they're not as productive as they could be. Okay. So when you have service technicians that are billable 75 to 80% of the time, that's probably their max. Crews, installation projects and things like that, where they're there all day on a job or there 2 days or a week or whatever, their productivity maximum is 91%. And how do I get that number? Well, I figured 2,080 hours a year. We've got vacation, we have holidays, we have meeting, we have training. And that drops it to about 1,900 hours a year. And that's about a 91% maximum. So if they're 85, 90%, you probably got max out of your installation crews too. All right, so that's one way to do it. And the other way to do it is to make sure that overhead is not increasing. All right, their overhead has been increasing over the past years because of their marketing spend, as we've talked about. And so we have to flatten the marketing spend. And I know it's killing him to do this. But those are two ways to start the growth of 30% on the bottom line rather than 30% on the top line. You know, when you think about it, if you say no revenue growth is boring, and my answer to that is no profit will kill you. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. And we can tell by looking at his trending graphs that revenue has done this lovely increase of about 30% a year. And profits have been steadily eroding because of what they're spending on overhead and marketing. And they're getting pretty close to zero, which is not where you want to be. So growing profit by 30% rather than revenue by 30% will actually save his business. So death by this little cut, pay attention to profit, not only revenue. Thank you for joining us. Choose one thing you discovered and implement it in your business. These ideas, tactics, and strategies help you make more money, have more free time, and give back. If you like today's program, spread the word. Please review this podcast on any device you're listening to it on. Help a fellow contractor make more money too. For comments or questions, call me at 770-729-0258 or email Ruth King at hvacchannel.tv. Thanks for listening. Have a great and profitable day.